Now we're going to explain the Baal HaMaor, Rav Zerachia Halevi, the Razah, his explanation of the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Amud Beis. But before we go into that, just remember one thing, okay? Here is Japan. Here is the eastern border of China. Here is Yerushalayim. At least according to the way that the Chazon Ish understands the Baal HaMaor, everything west of Yerushalayim, continuing all the way to the eastern border of China, is defined as the West. Okay, so if a person lives in the West, they are living in an area of 270 degrees east of Yerushalayim, all the way to the eastern border of China. This section, 90 degrees east of Yerushalayim till the eastern border of China, is called the East. The consequence of that opinion is 3/4 of the Earth's globe is defined as the West, whereas 1/4 is the East. Now, the difference that makes is that the West is the time or the day of the West follows that of Yerushalayim, whereas the East precedes Yerushalayim. So theoretically, morning in China precedes morning in Yerushalayim. But morning in Japan, because Japan is in the West, its morning follows the day or the morning of Yerushalayim. Okay? So we all together on that, because from here to here is the West, and Japan is therefore still in the West. Its morning is a day after the morning of Yerushalayim, whereas China, which is in the East, precedes Yerushalayim. Okay, now let's continue with the Baal HaMaor's explanation of the Gemara. Now, by reference to the notes that are titled Kav HaTarikh B'Halacha, the halachic dateline, the two rules in Rosh Hashanah 20b, and Rav Zerachia Halevi's interpretation. Okay, so let's look at the bottom of page 1, the text of the Talmud, which is underlined. Rabbi Zera shalach lahu tzarich shihei laila v'yom min hachodesh. Rav Zera sent to them, it is necessary to have a night followed by a day from the chodesh, meaning after the new moon. Go to page 2, at the very top, Avud Rav Simlai, Machashin et Toldato. The father of Abba, the father of Rav Simlai, says you calculate the moled. Noled kodem chatzot biyadu shenira samuch l'shkiat hachama. If the moled is calculated to be before midday in Yerushalayim, then you know for a fact that it can be seen before sunset. Lo nolad kolon chatzot biyadu shlo nira samuch l'shkiat hachama. And if it's calculated not to occur before midday in Yerushalayim, then you know for a fact that it cannot be seen before sunset. Rule number 1. It is necessary that there should be on the new moon a night and a day of the new moon. What this rule means is that it has nothing to do with what the witnesses in Yerushalayim can or cannot see. It's a statement by Reb Zera saying that in order for the 30th day to be ra'ui, worthy for a public proclamation of the Sanhedrin, there has to be some place in the world where the new moon can be sighted right before sunset of the 29th day, such that a full night of the 30th and followed by a full day of the 30th occurs after the moled. Now this can only take place in some place which is west of Yerushalayim, because as we just said a moment ago, the time in the west follows that of Yerushalayim. And since the moled is already being calculated to take place on the 30th, The only way you can get the Moled to be sighted at the end of the 29th is someplace in the far, far west. And if you say that the far west goes as far as China's eastern border, you could be theoretically including Japan. So Reb Zera's first statement is that theoretically, in order for the 30th day in Jerusalem to be ra'ui for a proclamation of the Sanhedrin Mekudesh, 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 somewhere in the world, there has to be possibility that the Moled can be sighted, that the new moon can be sighted right before sunset at the end of the 29th day of the month. So it's got to be in the west. Okay, so that's, let's just, following what it says over here, there must theoretically exist some place in the west where the Moled can be sighted closely before sunset on the 29th. If you just read through that paragraph, it's exactly what I just said. But I'll read it from here. Any place within the 270 degrees east of Earth's globe, west of Jerusalem, and east of China's eastern border is defined as the west. If the Moled can be theoretically decided a spot in this area before the end of the day, it should say 29, the end of day 29, then Rosh Chodesh can be proclaimed on day 30 by the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. This is because time in the west follows Yerushalayim, whereas time in the east precedes Yerushalayim. Since Japan is east of China's eastern border, Japan is defined as the west. Theoretically, it is possible that someone living in Japan can sight the Moled just before sunset on day 29, which is sometime during day 30 in Jerusalem. If so, day 30 in Jerusalem may be proclaimed as Rosh Chodesh. So now let's go. So now that we have that statement of Rav Zera, that there must be a place where you can see the Moled right before sunset on the 29th, let's take a look at Rule 2. In order for this to occur, okay, let's just read Rule 2 again. Abba, the father of Simlai, we calculate according to the new moon's birth, Moled. If it is born before midday in Yerushalayim, then certainly it will be seen shortly before sunset somewhere in the west. If it was not born before midway, then certainly it will not have been seen shortly before sunset on day 29 in the west. Okay, so in order for day 30 in Yerushalayim to be right for a calculation, we just said a moment ago that there has to be a sighting of the new moon sometime right before sunset on the day 29 in the west. How can this happen? Comes Abba, the father of Simlai, and says, well, I'll tell you when it happens. If you could calculate that the Moled in Yerushalayim takes place before Chatzot, midday in Yerushalayim, then you know that somewhere in the west, which is time which follows Yerushalayim, then the Moled will take place before sunset on the 29th, and therefore you will have a full night and a day following the new Moled, so that 30 in Yerushalayim is proclaimable as Rosh Chodesh. But if you calculate that the Moled takes place after Chatzot in Yerushalayim, that can't be anywhere in the world. So let me just read it. In order to publicly proclaim Rosh Chodesh in Jerusalem on its day 30, a full 30th night followed by a full 30th day must follow the Moled somewhere in the world. Continuing with the example above, the only way that is theoretically possible to sight the Moled in Japan, which is in the west, before sunset on day 29, which would cause a full 30th night followed by a full 30th day after the Moled somewhere in the world, is when the Moled is calculated to occur before midday Chatzot in Yerushalayim. So automatically, therefore, if the Moled is calculated to occur before midday in Yerushalayim on day 30, then day 30 can be publicly claimed as Rosh Chodesh by the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. However, if the Moled is calculated to occur after midday, Chatzot Yerushalayim, there is absolutely no possible place in the world that it can theoretically be sighted, including Japan, which is the far reaches of the west. Consequently, the 30th day in Yerushalayim is not worthy, it's not ra'ui, and cannot be proclaimed as Rosh Chodesh. Day 31 is automatically day 1 of the next month with no official proclamation because of Kvar Kidshuhu Bashamayim. The new month has already been sanctified in heaven. So therefore, Rule 1 is not really a rule per se. It's a statement of fact. Such a place in the West does exist in theory, says Reb Zera. Because rule number 1 is true, rule 2 can dictate whether or not day 30 Yerushalayim is right. It's as if Abba, the father of Simlai, is saying, well, since what Reb Zera says is true, because the West is defined as all of this, and therefore someplace in the West you could have a sighting of the new Molid before or at right before sunset of day 29. Therefore, rule 2 kicks in, and if you calculate it's before Chatzot Yerushalayim, then you know that happened. Otherwise, it didn't happen. Okay. The consequence of the Baal HaMaor's, the Razah's interpretation is that a dateline in halacha does exist, and the Chazon Ish says that the Razah is setting the dateline at China's eastern border. Now, Rav Tuvchinski can possibly be right according to Chazon Ish, because Rule 2 can only take place in Japan. So Japan has to be defined as the West. Rav Tuvchinski says that the Talmud Rosh Hashanna 20b can be explained according to Rashi, as we said before, that these two rules of Rav Zera and Abba, the father of Simlai, are independent of each other, and they have to do with whether witnesses are believable, and has nothing to do with setting a dateline. And it does not put any dateline on the eastern coast of China.